Hello and welcome to the Bartholomew School GCSE English Literature revision video focusing on how to answer the 19th century novel question for English Literature Paper 1. This video focuses on Jekyll and Hyde, so if your set text is A Christmas Carol, you need to stop this video and find the correct one using your revision booklet or just looking through our YouTube channel. Before we start properly, make sure that you have in front of you your GCSE English Literature revision booklet which has the questions in it, a highlighter, a pen and some paper. Before we go any further, you need to stop the video, make sure you have all of those things and are ready to go. We're looking today at practice question 1 from the Jekyll and Hyde practice questions in your booklet. This is the one with the extract from chapter 2. In an exam, the first thing that you have to do is look really closely at the question. So let's do that now with your highlighter. The first thing to notice is the phrase starting with this extract. It tells us that we need to analyse the printed extract, but also that it is only a starting point. We have to have quotations that we know from the rest of the novel too. Next, notice the use of the word how. It tells us that we need to focus our answer on the techniques and methods that Stevenson uses. Thirdly, the subject of our answer needs to be how setting is used to create suspense. This stops us from writing everything we know about the novella, and it tells us that we have to be paying attention to how setting is used to create suspense in the extract and in the novel as a whole. It's also worth noticing how many times the question writes Stevenson's name. It tells us that we should be writing about the novel as a piece of literature. We mustn't write about the characters as though they are real people. And then lastly, as we've mentioned several times already, it asks us to write about the extract and the novel as a whole. This means we have to have learnt some quotations, otherwise we won't be able to refer to the whole text. So let's turn now to that extract. I'll read it aloud. You need to follow and with your highlighter pick out words, phrases and techniques that you think you could say something interesting about. Remember that the focus of the question is how Stevenson uses setting to create suspense. In this extract from chapter 2, Utterson waits to catch a glimpse of Mr. Hyde. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" So what could we have picked out? Well, I might have begun by exploring the surprisingly ordinary presentation of the evening. In fact, it's presented not as suspenseful, but as pleasant. I'd draw attention to the adjectives like fine and dry, and then look at the idea of the regular pattern of light and shadow. On the surface, it looks like all is as it should be, but what's interesting is that Utterson is clearly tense. This juxtaposition builds suspense. I'd then turn to look at the language of superstition and the ineffable, that is, what can't be expressed. Words like somehow and odd are used, but they're vague, and this adds to the impression of the sinister. Utterson's attention had never been before so sharply and decisively arrested, but there's no explanation for this, giving an impression of the uncanny. What's important here then is Utterson's experience of the setting, which does not match the more objective description of the fine dry evening that we have at the start of the extract. I might have moved on then to the use of sound to build up tension in the setting. The noun growl is somewhat threatening, and the intensifier very silent makes the description somehow unnatural. The build-up of sound as Hyde approaches again builds suspense. We know he is coming nearer. And then lastly, I'd want to look at the use of the domestic setting. I'd want to talk about Hyde being like one approaching home. Again, what's uncomfortable here is that Hyde appears on the surface to be behaving like an ordinary citizen. Stevenson uses the setting to remove the barriers that we might want to establish between this satanic figure and everyday society. Of course, it's not a problem if you've highlighted other elements in this passage. What matters is that you can write interestingly about those quotations and that they relate to the question. But you'll remember that this question doesn't just ask you about the extract, it also asks you about the rest of the novella. So I'd suggest that a good way of planning your ideas is to put them down in a table that looks a bit like this. I want to plan 3 or 4 really good analytical paragraphs using the ideas I've taken from the passage. So I had my quotations about the normality of the setting in the first instance. My idea that answers the question could be something like, Stevenson presents the ordinariness of London to emphasise the extraordinary otherness of Hyde. My second quotations were about Utterson's experience of the setting being different from the objective description of the setting. I might make the point that, furthermore, the use of Utterson as a voyeur and an interpreter of what he sees highlights Hyde's unnaturalness. Notice that I start with that word furthermore to demonstrate that this point builds on the previous one. Thirdly, I had my quotations about sound, and the point is straightforward. Stevenson uses sound to build the suspense of Hyde's approach. And then lastly, my more abstract point about domesticity and Hyde's comfort with the key could be Hyde's proximity to the domestic setting perhaps symbolises that the primitive evil he represents lurks not far beneath the surface of Victorian propriety and society. Once I've prepared what I'll say about the passage, I need to think about the rest of the novella. This is a good opportunity to think about structure, so I'm also going to keep in mind how the ideas about setting and suspense might change and develop as the novel continues. For each point I've made, I'm going to try and think of a linked passage or a quotation to develop my idea. So thinking about the ordinary nature of the setting here, contrast with its description later in the Carey murder chapter, where the setting is described in thick fog and becomes altogether more gothic. I can make effective contrasts here, so I'll put down a few quotations that describe Hyde's quarters as lower in social class. You can see those there. To connect with the idea of Utterson's superstitious view of Hyde, I'm going to explore a totally different setting, and that's that of the laboratory. It's in the laboratory that Hyde entirely replaces Jekyll, and I've found a useful quotation to learn for that. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. The laboratory is the setting that encapsulates that connection between the scientific and the supernatural. It's also not just in the extract that Stevenson uses setting to build up suspense to reveal Hyde. He does it in Jekyll's letter at the end of the novella, where there is no mirror when Jekyll makes his first transformation, so he has to cross the courtyard before he's able to see his own reflection as Hyde. I'll take this a bit further, because the build-up of suspense through setting is Stevenson's way of demonstrating to his reader that we are supposed to be horrified by Hyde. He prepares us for that horror of his reveal. And then for my final point about Hyde being uncomfortably close to domestic society, I can use any quotations that reveal something about the duality of man. Now this is a bit more conceptual, and I need to make sure that when I write it up, I'm sticking really closely to the idea of setting. So these quotations from elsewhere in the novella reveal why it's important that Hyde also has a role in the domestic setting. They're more about the philosophy of the setting in the extract than setting itself. I need to be careful when I write that up. I also have to link to context in my answer, so my very last bit of planning is going to be to make some notes about the kind of context I could write about. For the exploration of where Hyde is in London, I'll consider the Victorians' ideas about social class and the criminal underclass. I might be able to mention physiognomy here, but it might take me too far away from the idea of setting, so again I'll need to be a bit careful. When I consider Utterson's unease in the setting and the laboratory setting, I'll think about the idea of the uncanny, as well as ideas about science and superstition. Writing about the build-up of suspense through the use of the senses will allow me to consider the literary context of the Gothic. And then lastly, my point about evil lurking just beneath the surface of the niceties of society. I might think about ideas about Darwinism, about Victorian ideals, about presentation, about propriety. So this gives me the backbone of 4 paragraphs. You might not necessarily write them in this order. If you're aiming for a level 6 or above, you'll certainly want to have a sense of argument, and you'll have a brief introduction and conclusion. That might cause you to reorder your points slightly. But let's have a look at what one paragraph would look like written up into an essay. Stevenson presents the ordinariness of the setting of London in this extract to emphasise the extraordinary otherness of Hyde. Although we know that Utterson's patience will be rewarded, the description of the setting is tranquil and decidedly normal. The night is fine and dry, subverting our expectations for a dramatic event. The streets are as clean as a ballroom floor, a simile which draws attention to Victorian high society with its reference to the ballroom. Even the use of light would suggest that nothing untoward is expected. The lamps are unshaken, an adjective which has connotations of stability and normality. And Stephen describes their regular pattern of light and shadow, using the adjective regular and the noun pattern to suggest that everything in this setting is as it should be. Nonetheless, Utterson is uneasy, as indicated by the semantic field of military vigilance. He is at his post and on patrol, watching for and expecting something dangerous. Hyde's otherness, which Utterson, like Enfield in Chapter 1, cannot seem to articulate, is emphasised by its juxtaposition to the normality of the scene of this London evening. Later in the novella, however, the return to Hyde's quarters is described in unnatural, dingy fog. The surroundings are depicted as unsavoury. He lives in a dismal quarter of Soho, near to a gin palace, and therefore far more representative of Hyde's satanic, immoral character. Stevenson describes the house's blackguardly surroundings, using the setting to heighten the impression of Hyde as a figure of the Victorian criminal underclass. After the Carey murder, then, it becomes clear that Hyde is separate from the Victorian expectations of the upper classes because of his surroundings. He is other because socially and morally he is inferior. However, in the extract where Utterson first meets Hyde, what is unsettling is that Hyde's immorality is not signalled by the setting. Stevenson is perhaps implying that what is most worrying about Hyde's evil is that it is not as separate from respectable society as the Victorians might have liked to believe. So you can see in this paragraph that I've given a response to the question in my first sentence. I've then analysed a series of quotations from the extract in detail with technical terminology and interpretation. I've linked this to elsewhere in the novella, where I've also analysed in detail. I've developed my point through contextual reference, and I've finished off my paragraph with a link back to the question. This answer should take you 50 minutes to write. You can look back at any part of this video to help you with the planning, and you can use your revision booklet to remind you what's being assessed. Have a go at writing your response, give it to your teacher and get some feedback, and then you can try any of the other questions in the booklet using exactly the same method, or watch the video again for some extra help. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck with your response.